There's a photograph that hangs in the Merrin family estate in northern Vermont. It shows a wedding from 1938. The bride and groom stand side by side smiling. They look identical, not similar. Identical. Same eyes, same jawline, same hands, because they were twins, brother and sister. And this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a scandal. It was tradition. For nearly 100 years, every firstborn son in the Merrin family married his twin sister. No one outside the family knew. No one inside the family questioned it until 1976, when one son walked into a police station and told them everything. What he revealed didn't just destroy his family. It uncovered a bloodline built on a secret so disturbing the town tried to bury the story forever. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Merrin family arrived in America in 1872. They came from a remote region in the Bavarian Alps, a place so isolated that entire villages went generations without outsiders. The family patriarch, Wilhelm Merrin, brought with him his wife, his 3 sons, and a leather-bound journal written in Old German script. That journal, according to those who later saw fragments of it, contained genealogical records going back to the 16th century. It also contained instructions, rules, bloodline mandates that Wilhelm believed were sacred. Wilhelm purchased over 200 acres of land in the Green Mountains of Vermont, far from the nearest town. He built a stone manor that resembled the fortresses of old Europe. The family was reclusive. They didn't attend church. They didn't socialize. They homeschooled their children and kept to themselves. Locals thought they were simply eccentric immigrants, clinging to old world ways. No one suspected what was happening inside those stone walls. The first marriage occurred in 1893. Wilhelm's eldest son, Friedrich, turned 21. His twin sister, Greta, turned 21 on the same day. Naturally, there was no ceremony in town, no announcement in the local paper. The wedding was held in the family's private chapel, witnessed only by immediate family. Friedrich and Greta were married by their father, who had declared himself a minister of his own faith. They consummated the marriage that night. Within a year, Greta gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. This wasn't seen as a tragedy. It was seen as a triumph. The prophecy, as Wilhelm called it, had held true. The bloodline was pure. The twins were healthy. And 21 years later, those twins would marry each other. This was the design. This was the purpose. The Merrin family believed they were preserving something sacred, something that predated Christianity, a genetic covenant that kept their blood undiluted by the outside world. For decades, this continued in silence. The family grew wealthier. They owned mills, logging operations, and eventually a small bank. They were respected in business, if not in society. People whispered about their strangeness, but wealth bought silence. And the Merrins never gave anyone a reason to look closer until the children started to change. By the 1920s, the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. The Merrin children were different, not just in temperament but in body, in mind, in ways that couldn't be hidden forever. There were tremors in the hands of some, seizures that came without warning. A boy born in 1918 never learned to speak, though his eyes followed movement, and he understood commands. A girl born in 1922 had fingers that bent backward at impossible angles. Her spine curved so severely that by age 12 she couldn't stand upright. The family called these afflictions gifts, signs of purity. They believed that suffering was the price of maintaining the bloodline's integrity. Wilhelm's grandson Otto, who had become the family patriarch by then, kept meticulous records. He documented every birth, every marriage, every abnormality. He measured skulls. He traced patterns in eye color and bone structure. He was convinced that they were approaching something, a perfection that would reveal itself if they remained faithful to the design. But Otto also understood that the outside world would not see it this way. So the family developed a system. Children who were too visibly afflicted were kept inside. They lived in the upper floors of the manor in rooms with barred windows. The family told neighbors they were fragile, sickly, that fresh air was dangerous for them. Doctors were never called. When a child died, and several did before reaching adulthood, they were buried in the family cemetery on the estate. No death certificates, no public records, just a stone marker with a name and 2 dates. The ones who appeared normal were allowed limited interaction with the outside world. They attended town functions occasionally. They made business transactions. They smiled and shook hands and played the part of a respectable, if unusual, family, but they always returned to the manor. They always married their twin, and they always produced the next generation. By the 1940s, the Merrin family tree had become a column. Almost no branches, just a straight line down through time. Twins marrying twins, generation after generation. Geneticists would later call it one of the most extreme cases of inbreeding ever documented in America. But in 1947, when the family celebrated another twin wedding, they called it destiny. They had no idea that the bloodline's final generation had already been born. Daniel and Diana Merrin were born on March 14, 1955. They were the last set of twins the family would produce. Their father, Heinrich, was already showing signs of what the family refused to call illness. He had violent mood swings and periods of confusion, where he didn't recognize his own wife, his twin sister, his bride. By the time the children were 5 years old, Heinrich had to be restrained during his episodes. The family kept him in a locked room in the East Wing. Diana would later tell investigators that she remembered hearing him scream at night, screaming words that made no sense, screaming at people who weren't there. Daniel and Diana grew up knowing their fate. It was never hidden from them. On their 8th birthday, their grandfather Otto sat them down and explained the covenant. He told them they were special, chosen, that their blood carried something ancient and pure that the modern world had lost. He showed them the journal. He showed them the family tree. He showed them photographs of all the twins who had come before, their parents, their grandparents, all the way back to Friedrich and Greta in 1893. Diana accepted it. She had been raised to accept it. She played with Daniel, studied with Daniel. As they grew older, she began to see him not as a brother, but as an inevitability. The family prepared her. They told her what would happen on her 21st birthday, how the ceremony would proceed, and what her duties would be. She embroidered her own wedding dress starting at age 16, white silk with silver thread, the same pattern her mother had used and her grandmother and every Merrin bride before her. But Daniel was different. He began asking questions around age 13, questions that made his mother uncomfortable. Why didn't they have friends outside the family? Why did the children in town look at them strangely? Why did his cousin, born 2 years before him, have seizures so violent that she bit through her own tongue? His mother told him not to ask such things. His grandfather told him that doubt was the enemy of purity, that the modern world was sick and the Merrin family was the cure. Daniel stopped asking questions out loud, but he didn't stop thinking them. And when he turned 17, he did something no Merrin had ever done before. He left the estate alone and went into town. He went to the library. The library in Barton, Vermont, was small, 3 rooms in a converted church building, but it had books on science, on genetics, on heredity. Daniel spent hours there over the course of several months, always during times when he knew his family wouldn't notice his absence. He told them he was walking the property, inspecting the old mill. They didn't question it. He was the heir, the firstborn son. He was allowed some freedom. What Daniel discovered in those books horrified him. He learned what inbreeding actually did, how recessive genes compounded, how each generation increased the likelihood of genetic disorders, mental illness, and physical deformities. He read about the Habsburg jaw, about the consequences of royal bloodlines that married cousins for centuries. The Merrins had gone further, much further. They had been marrying siblings for 4 generations. The genetic damage wasn't a mystery, it was a mathematical certainty. He began to see his family clearly for the first time. His father's madness wasn't divine suffering, it was the result of a collapsed gene pool. His cousin's seizures weren't signs of purity, they were neurological damage caused by generations of incest. Even he and Diana, who appeared relatively healthy, carried the genetic burden. If they married, if they had children, those children would almost certainly be severely disabled or worse. Daniel tried to talk to his grandfather. It was winter 1972. Daniel was 17. He brought one of the books with him. He tried to explain what he had learned. Otto listened in silence. Then he stood, walked to the fireplace, and threw the book into the flames. He told Daniel that the outside world was full of lies designed to corrupt pure bloodlines, that scientists were agents of degeneracy, that the Merrin family had survived for 100 years in America precisely because they had rejected these modern poisons. Daniel realized then that nothing he said would matter. His grandfather was not ignorant. He was a true believer. The evidence didn't matter. The suffering didn't matter. The covenant was all that mattered. And in 4 years, when Daniel turned 21, he would be expected to marry his sister to consummate that marriage to produce the next generation of twins to continue the cycle. That night, Daniel made a decision. He would not wait 4 years. He would not let this happen. But he also knew he couldn't simply run away. Diana would still be trapped. The family would find another way. He needed to destroy the covenant entirely. Daniel began documenting everything. He found his grandfather's records, the ones Otto had kept hidden in a locked cabinet in his study. Late at night, when the house was silent, Daniel would pick the lock and photograph pages with a camera he had stolen from town. Birth records, marriage certificates that were never filed with the state, medical observations written in Otto's precise handwriting, descriptions of deformities, notes about children who had died, a girl in 1931 who lived only 3 days, a boy in 1944 who never opened his eyes. He also began talking to Diana. Really talking to her, not as a future husband, but as a brother trying to save his sister. At first she didn't want to listen. She had been conditioned her entire life to accept this fate. The family had told her it was beautiful, sacred, that she was part of something larger than herself. But Daniel was patient. He showed her the books he had hidden in his room. He explained the science slowly, carefully. He asked her to look at their father, to really look at him, to see what the family called divine and recognize it for what it truly was. It took months, but gradually Diana began to see. She began to understand that what the family called love was actually imprisonment. What they called purity was actually poison. And what they called destiny was actually a choice. A choice that had been made for them, but a choice they could unmake. By 1975, Daniel had a plan. He and Diana would leave together. They would go to the authorities with the documentation. They would expose what the Merrin family had been doing for a century. But there was a problem. Otto was dying. The cancer had spread through his lungs and into his bones. The family was preparing for his death, and with it the transfer of power. Daniel would become the patriarch, and the family expected him to fulfill the covenant immediately. They moved the wedding date up. Daniel and Diana would marry in the spring of 1976, just after their 21st birthday. Whether they were ready or not, if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. Daniel knew they were running out of time. So on February 9, 1976, he and Diana made their move. They left before dawn. Daniel had packed 2 bags and hidden them in the woods a quarter-mile from the estate. Diana left a note on her bed. It said only, "I'm sorry. I can't." They walked through snow to the main road and hitchhiked to Burlington. Diana had never been more than 10 miles from the estate in her entire life. She had never seen a city, never been in a crowd. Daniel held her hand the entire way. They went directly to the police station on North Wookey Avenue. Daniel carried a folder containing everything he had documented. Photographs of the records, copies of the family tree, a list of children who had died and been buried without death certificates, and medical descriptions written in Otto's hand that detailed suffering no child should endure. The desk sergeant didn't believe them at first. He thought they were disturbed, perhaps on drugs. But Daniel was calm and methodical. He laid out the evidence piece by piece. Slowly, the sergeant's expression changed from skepticism to horror. Within hours, investigators were dispatched to the Merrin estate. They brought a warrant, social workers, and doctors. What they found confirmed everything Daniel had reported. The family cemetery contained graves of children who had never been registered with the state. The locked rooms in the upper floors still held evidence of the children who had been hidden there. Medical equipment that had never been inspected, restraints bolted to walls, and in a study they found the journal, the original journal that Wilhelm Merrin had brought from Bavaria in 1872. It was written in a mixture of German and Latin. Translators would later reveal that it contained not just genealogical records, but a belief system, a conviction that the Merrin bloodline descended from an ancient Bavarian cult that practiced sacred incest as a form of spiritual purification. Wilhelm hadn't invented this practice. He had inherited it, and he had brought it to America, believing he could preserve it in the New World, away from the laws and judgments of modern Europe. The family members still living at the estate were taken into custody. Otto died 3 days later in a hospital bed, refusing to speak to investigators. Daniel and Diana were placed in protective custody. The story was too disturbing, too unbelievable for the local press to handle responsibly. Most newspapers ran brief mentions: a strange family, an investigation, no details. The town of Barton wanted to forget, and for decades they succeeded. The legal proceedings were quiet, almost deliberately so. The state of Vermont charged several surviving family members with fraud, child endangerment, and failure to report deaths. But there were no charges of incest. Vermont law in 1976 had provisions against marriage between siblings. However, the Merrin marriages had never been legally registered. They were ceremonial only, performed by family patriarchs who claimed religious authority they didn't legally possess. In the eyes of the state, the marriages hadn't technically occurred, which meant the law had few tools to prosecute what had actually happened. Most of the family members accepted plea deals. They were given probation, fines, and psychological evaluation requirements. The estate was seized for unpaid taxes and back penalties. It was eventually sold to a development company that tore down the manor in 1981. The family cemetery was relocated to a municipal plot. The graves were marked with simple stones. No names, just numbers. Daniel and Diana tried to build normal lives. They moved to separate cities. Diana went to Boston and worked as a seamstress. She never married and never had children. She told a friend years later that she couldn't imagine being touched by anyone, that her body still felt like it belonged to a covenant she had escaped but could never fully leave behind. She died in 2003 from lung cancer. She was 48 years old. Daniel moved to Portland, Maine. He changed his last name and became a carpenter. He married a woman named Sarah in 1984, and they had one daughter. He never told his wife the full story, just that his family had been unusual and strict, that he had left and never gone back. His daughter grew up not knowing that her father's bloodline carried the genetic echoes of 4 generations of sibling marriage. Daniel made sure of that. He had genetic testing done privately because he wanted to know what he might pass on. The results showed markers for several recessive disorders, but nothing that manifested in him. His daughter was tested too without her knowledge. Through routine medical checks he requested, she was clear. Daniel died in 2019. He was 64. In his final weeks, he gave an interview to a graduate student researching genetic isolation in American families. He told her everything. He said he wanted people to know, not for attention, not for sympathy, but because secrets like this survive in silence. And silence, he said, is how the cycle continues. The recording of that interview is housed at the University of Vermont. It runs 3 hours and 42 minutes. In it, Daniel describes the wedding dress his sister embroidered, the journal his great-great-grandfather carried across an ocean, the screams of his father in the locked room, the moment he realized love and imprisonment could wear the same face, and the day he chose truth over blood. The Merrin family line ended with Daniel and Diana. No cousins survived. No descendants continued the name. The estate is gone. The journal was seized as evidence and later lost in a courthouse fire in 1994. Whether that fire was accidental remains unclear, but the story remains buried in court documents, in medical records, in the memory of a town that tried very hard to forget. Some legacies are meant to end. Some bloodlines are meant to break. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is look at everything they were taught was sacred and call it by its true name. Not destiny, not purity, not love, just damage passed down generation after generation until someone finally says,